Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We've built cities that touch the clouds, machines that think, and rockets that leave our planet behind. We've mapped the oceans, tamed the deserts, and turned night into day with the flick of a switch. But if you rewind time back 2 million years, everything changes. There are no cities, no countries, no names. Just small bands of humans scattered across Africa, fighting to stay alive in a world that wants them gone. Volcanic ash falls like snow. Predators rule the plains. Droughts, plagues, and ice crush one generation after another, and yet, somehow, we survive. Not by strength, not by speed, but by something else, by memory, by fire, by the stubborn refusal to stop trying. Every tool, every story, every heartbeat across those 2 million years leads to you sitting here right now, watching this video. That's the crazy part. Every person alive is proof of an unbroken chain stretching back to a handful of survivors who should have vanished long ago. So, subscribe if you haven't yet. Maybe tell me where you're watching from. Because when I see comments from London at sunrise and Manila past midnight, I can't help thinking about them, the humans who refused to quit, who carried us through 2 million years of almost failing and didn't. 2 million years ago, there were no cities, no roads, no words, no fire, not even the idea of a tomorrow. Just a handful of humans standing on the African plains, surrounded by predators that saw them as prey. If you could go back to that time, you wouldn't recognize us. We were smaller, weaker, quieter, living in scattered groups barely holding on. The world belonged to claws and teeth, not to thought. But somewhere out there, in the heat and dust, something began to change. It didn't look like much, just a small shape of rock in a human hand, being struck against another rock again and again until a sharp edge appeared. That sound, stone against stone, was the first spark of everything that would follow. Imagine the heat rising from the savannah, the hum of insects, the cry of distant lions. Our ancestors were hungry, desperate, and barefoot on land that wanted them dead. But they had something no other animal had: curiosity. They watched what happened when one stone broke another, when bones split and revealed marrow, when fire started from lightning strikes and left behind roasted meat. These weren't accidents anymore. They were lessons. The first tools were born not from strength, but from observation. Each flake of stone that fell was a thought taking shape. Those early humans didn't know they were changing the rules of life on Earth. They were just trying to survive one more day. Every cut of a sharp rock meant food. Every successful hunt meant one more night alive. Over time, survival began to look like skill, and skill became tradition. One human showed another how to shape a better edge, and that moment of teaching was the birth of culture. Knowledge started to pass from hand to hand, from generation to generation, not through instinct, but through memory. That's when humanity truly began. The planet was different then. Africa's great rift valleys stretched like open wounds across the land. Forests gave way to grasslands, and rainfall came and went like a coin toss. The climate pushed humans to the edge, forcing them to move, adapt, and think faster than ever before. In that constant struggle, our ancestors learned how to read the world. They studied animal tracks, wind patterns, the colour of clouds before a storm. Every detail became a clue, every discovery a step forward. Evolution didn't reward the strongest, it rewarded the learners. If you could meet one of them today, you might not understand their words, but you'd recognize their eyes. The look of someone who refuses to give up. They had no language, but they had purpose. Each sunrise was another test, and every sunset another small victory. From those victories came everything that followed, every tool, every fire, every idea. We are their echo. When you hold a phone, strike a match, or build something with your hands, you're repeating their story. 2 million years ago, a small band of humans found a way to turn fear into invention, hunger into creativity, and survival into art. From the ashes and the stones, they began to build the world we now call home. For almost 2 million years, the night was a thing to be feared. Darkness belonged to predators. When the sun fell, humans became shadows, hiding from sharper teeth and faster legs. Lightning strikes sometimes lit trees on fire, and for a few moments the world glowed red and gold. But then the flames vanished, and the darkness returned, until one day someone didn't run from the fire. They walked toward it. They picked up a burning branch, felt the heat, and realized this wild thing could be controlled. That was the moment everything changed. Imagine the first person who dared to steal fire. Maybe it was after a storm when lightning had split a tree in half, setting the wood ablaze. They watched from a distance, terrified but fascinated. The heat pushed against their skin. The light danced like a living spirit. Then they reached forward, grabbed a piece of burning wood, and carried it home. For the first time, light followed them into the dark. They didn't create fire yet, but they had learned to borrow it. Keeping that fire alive became a sacred duty. If it went out, the group would have to wait for another lightning storm. So someone always stayed awake, feeding the flames with dry grass and branches, guarding the light while others slept. Fire became more than warmth. It was safety, protection, and power. Around the flames, humans could see each other's faces after sunset. They could talk, plan, and share food without fear. The night no longer belonged to the beasts, it belonged to them. At some point, they learned more than just keeping fire alive. They learned how to make it. Rubbing sticks together, striking stones to create sparks, they discovered that this magic could be summoned at will. That discovery didn't just change survival, it changed biology. Cooked food gave more energy, faster digestion, and smaller guts. With less time spent chewing and more energy for the brain, evolution took a new path. Fire didn't just protect us, it built us. Imagine what it felt like to see your first cooked meal. The smell of roasted meat, the taste of warmth that no raw food could match. Fire softened roots, boiled water, burned parasites away. It made food safe, made nights bright, and made the cold bearable. It brought people together. The flicker of firelight on faces is the first memory of human storytelling. Words took shape around those flames. Myths were born there long before any written language. Even now, thousands of generations later, we are still drawn to fire. Campfires, candles, glowing screens, all of them echo that same ancient pull. The first fire didn't just change how humans lived. It changed what it meant to be human, because once we carried light into the dark, there was no going back. The fear of night turned into wonder, and for the first time, we didn't just survive the world, we began to shape it. Long before there were roads or borders or names, there were rivers. They were the first maps carved into the skin of the earth, guiding humans through a world too vast to understand. Wherever water flowed, life followed. It was the thread stitching scattered families together, the original network connecting bands that might otherwise have vanished in isolation. For millions of years, water wasn't just something to drink. It was direction, memory, and destiny. Imagine walking under the sun with no compass, no landmarks, only a dry horizon that seemed to stretch forever. To survive, you learned to listen for water. The buzz of insects, the calls of birds, the faint shimmer of green in the distance, those signs meant life. When humans found rivers, they found everything they needed. Fish to eat, clay to shape, reeds for shelter, and mud that recorded the footprints of every creature that came before. Each stream was a story written in ripples and tracks. The rivers taught humans movement. During wet seasons, they swelled and spread, filling plains with richness. When they dried, they whispered where to go next. Lakes shrank into puddles, puddles into cracks, but the memory of water remained in the land. The people who remembered those paths became the ones who survived. They knew which pools held out through the dry months, which valleys caught the first rain, which streams could be trusted. That memory wasn't written down. It was sung, shared, repeated around fires, carried in the minds of wanderers who followed the same river year after year. Over generations, rivers became the arteries of early civilization. Where there was constant water, people stopped moving. They built camps that turned into villages, villages that turned into worlds. Animals came to drink, and humans waited for them. The hunt became easier. Children were born near the same shores their parents had known. These were the first homes, temporary, fragile, but rooted in something that stayed even when people left. The river was permanence in a world that changed too fast. But rivers also connected. Different bands might camp at the same bend months apart, leaving behind traces of themselves: stone flakes, broken bones, the ashes of fire. Over time, paths crossed. Strangers met and realized they were not alone. They traded stories, food, and mates. They shared songs and tools. This web of encounters began to link humanity together into something larger than single tribes. Water didn't just sustain life, it carried culture. If you look at a map of ancient human sites today, it's almost poetic. Nearly every one rests along an old river, an ancient lake, or the ghost of a spring long since dried. It's proof that water was our first teacher, the force that shaped where we walked, how we lived, and how we remembered. Every time you hear rain, every time you watch water move, you're hearing the same rhythm that guided our ancestors 2 million years ago. The sound that told them where to go and reminded them of who they were. There was a time when every tool on earth came from accident. A rock fell, a stick broke, a bone splintered in just the right way, and for a brief moment, survival got a little easier. But something changed when humans stopped waiting for accidents. Somewhere on the African plains, a pair of hands began shaping the future on purpose. A simple stone became a plan. The first time someone looked at a raw piece of rock and imagined what it could become, humanity took its first step toward tomorrow. The early tools were crude but revolutionary. A single sharp edge meant bones could be split for marrow, hides could be cut into strips, and plants could be processed for food. Each tool was a small victory, but behind every strike of stone against stone was something bigger. Intention. Before this, animals reacted to their world. Humans began to redesign it. That was the quiet moment when thought became creation. The mind reached forward into the future, and hands followed. The difference between chance and design might seem small, but it changed everything. A random stone could help you once. A shaped tool could help you forever. Over generations, humans began crafting not just individual tools, but systems of tools. Different shapes for different tasks. Stones for cutting, scrapers for hides, choppers for wood. Each new tool created a new possibility, and every possibility required memory. The knowledge of how to make something had to be shared and practiced. This meant humans weren't just learning, they were teaching. To make a tool, you had to imagine it first. That's what made early humans unique. They could see something that didn't exist yet and bring it to life through effort and patience. That kind of thinking is what built everything after. Fire, shelter, writing, cities, all of it begins with that one spark of imagination carved into stone. Each flake that flew from a rock was a thought turned real, and the more precise the flake, the sharper the mind behind it. Archaeologists can still see those thoughts today. Ancient sites filled with discarded stone chips tell a story of practice and persistence. You can almost picture it. A figure sitting cross-legged, striking a stone just right, testing its edge, then starting again. Not out of instinct, but because they wanted to make it better. Every mistake was a lesson, every success a step forward. Slowly, those lessons built into something incredible, a culture of invention. From that moment on, humans were no longer just surviving. They were experimenting, they were planning, They were imagining futures. The same brain that once shaped a rock to cut meat would one day shape metal, build engines, and launch rockets. It all began with that first act of creation. The moment when someone looked at a stone and didn't see what it was, but what it could be. That was the day humanity stopped waiting for the world to change and started changing it instead. Long before schools, blackboards, or language, there were teachers. They didn't stand in front of classrooms. They sat by fires, knelt in rivers, or crouched beside stone flakes, showing someone smaller how to hold a tool the right way. Teaching didn't begin as kindness. It began as survival. When life itself depended on what you knew, knowledge became the most valuable thing a human could give. Passing it on was the difference between extinction and evolution. Imagine a child watching their parent carve a tool from stone. Every movement mattered. One wrong strike and the rock shattered. One perfect one and a blade appeared. That child learned by watching, copying, and repeating. Slowly, those gestures became tradition. The rhythm of survival was passed through imitation. The first lesson of humanity wasn't taught in words. It was taught in silence, in shared attention, in patience. When that child grew old enough to teach someone else, something extraordinary happened. Knowledge didn't just survive, it multiplied. Elders became walking libraries. They carried memories of where the rivers ran deepest, which roots were safe to eat when the rains would come, and where the lions hunted. They remembered the mistakes that cost lives, so that others wouldn't repeat them. Each story told by a fire wasn't entertainment, it was a manual for living. In those stories, the wisdom of generations was encoded in myth and memory. A tale about a foolish hunter was really a warning about overconfidence. A story about a lost traveler was a map hidden in words. Teaching changed how humans thought. Animals learned through instinct and trial. Humans learned through shared experience. This allowed progress to speed up across generations instead of resetting each time. What one person discovered, everyone could use. If a single mind found a new way to hunt or cook or heal, that knowledge could travel through the tribe, spreading like fire. Teaching made intelligence contagious. Over time, humans began to value those who knew the most. Elders weren't just survivors, they were leaders. They remembered the old seasons, the safe paths, the sacred places. Their advice could mean life or death for the entire group. In this way, wisdom became power, but not the kind that ruled by fear. It ruled through memory. The oldest among them carried the story of the people, connecting past to present. Without them, the thread of knowledge would snap. Even now, in a world full of screens and satellites, we still learn the same way. We watch, we copy, we teach. Every tutorial, every shared video, every lesson passed down is just a digital echo of what began around ancient fires. Teaching is the human superpower, the force that let us outthink predators, survive disasters, and build civilizations. Because one day, 1,000,000 years ago, someone decided not to keep their secret to themselves. They showed another how to strike the stone, and in doing so, they taught humanity how to never start from zero again. There were times in our history when the human story almost ended. The earth turned against us. Rain stopped falling. Rivers dried into dust. Herds disappeared over the horizon and never came back. The world shrank into silence, and the few humans who remained were left staring at an empty sky. These were the Hunger Years, long before written history, when survival was no longer guaranteed and every sunrise felt like a borrowed gift. Imagine the ground cracked and bleeding heat, the air so dry that your breath felt like smoke. Every step was a search for food or water, every night a prayer for morning. Families walked for days with nothing to eat, chasing rumors of rain. The old ones fell behind first, then the children. When people talk about extinction, they think of meteors or volcanoes, but sometimes the end of a species comes as a whisper, just a slow thinning, generation after generation. until only a few are left. Scientists call it a bottleneck. It's when a population shrinks so small that the entire future of a species fits inside a single campfire circle. For humans, that happened more than once. One of the worst was around 900,000 years ago. Climate chaos gripped the planet. Ice spread across continents, cutting off rain patterns that once fed Africa. Forests turned to scrub, lakes vanished, and animals that humans depended on starved or migrated away. We were reduced to maybe 1,000 breeding individuals. That's fewer people than most high schools today. Yet somehow, they survived. The Hunger Years forged us. When food grew scarce, humans had to become inventors. They learned to dig for roots buried deep underground, to crack open bones for marrow, to chase small prey instead of waiting for big ones. They learned that cooperation was the only answer. One hunter could starve, but a group could share. One mind could fail, but 10 minds together could adapt. The weak didn't vanish. They found strength in each other. The bottleneck also changed us in ways we still carry. When populations get that small, evolution speeds up. Every advantage counts. Better memory, sharper problem solving, stronger bonds, all were selected for because only the most adaptable survived. Even our emotions evolved in those desperate times. Empathy wasn't softness. It was survival. Caring for the sick or the old meant keeping knowledge alive. Protecting children meant keeping the species alive. Those instincts became part of who we are. It's strange to think that all 8 billion of us today came from that tiny handful who refused to die. Their world was brutal, their chances almost zero, but they kept moving, kept learning, kept teaching. Every one of us carries the memory of those hunger years in our genes. Every time we overcome disaster, every time we rebuild after loss, we're reenacting that same ancient will to live. The Hunger Years didn't break humanity, they defined it. Before humans could speak, they pointed, grunted, and mimed their way through survival. A raised hand meant danger. A glance toward the horizon meant, follow me. For millions of years, that was enough. But somewhere deep in our past, something new began to stir inside the human mind. A spark. The moment we stopped only reacting to the world we could see and started talking about the world we couldn't. Time, plans, dreams, memories. That was the beginning of language, and it changed everything. Imagine a small group huddled around a fire as night falls. The hunt is over. Smoke rises into the dark, and the air smells of ash and meat. One person gestures toward the valley, trying to warn about the lions they saw earlier, but another wants to say more, something beyond pointing. Maybe they want to tell the group that the lions come at dawn, or that they saw tracks near the waterhole 2 days ago. Those ideas exist in the mind, but not yet in words. The struggle to share them is the first step towards speech. Language wasn't invented in a single moment. It grew like a vine, twisting through generations. Sounds that started as instinctive calls became symbols. Gestures turned into meaning. Over time, humans began to link ideas together. One sound for water, another for danger, then combinations. Water near danger, danger coming soon. For the first time, humans could talk about the future and the past. That changed how we thought. Communication became more than warning and mimicry. It became strategy. The ability to describe things not present in front of us, places unseen, moments not yet lived, gave humans a power no other species had. Hunters could plan tomorrow's chase while sitting by tonight's fire. Parents could teach children lessons from events long gone. Groups could coordinate without needing to see the threat. Language turned imagination into a tool, a bridge between minds. The more humans talked, the more their brains adapted. Scientists believe that as language developed, parts of the brain grew to handle complex symbols, memory, and empathy. To understand someone's words, you had to picture what they were picturing. That mental connection created deeper cooperation. Language didn't just transmit information, it connected emotions. It made empathy possible on a new level. When you could tell someone how you felt, survival became a shared mission instead of a lonely struggle. Even the rhythm of language shaped culture. Around fires, stories began. First they were warnings, then lessons, then myths. Each retelling made memories stronger, carried across generations. Words became the vessel for everything humans had learned, a way to preserve the past and invent the future at the same time. The language spark wasn't just about speaking, it was about thinking together. It was the dawn of imagination, the beginning of shared minds. And once humanity learned to speak, silence would never rule us again. The first humans were not hunters of power. They were survivors in a world ruled by monsters. Leopards dragged kills into trees. Hyenas broke bones with jaws like hammers. And massive terror birds patrolled the grasslands with beaks sharp enough to pierce skulls. To live in that world, humans had to learn the art of stealing. They were too small to fight and too slow to run, but they were clever. They watched, waited, and turned danger into opportunity. Every predator left scraps behind, and humans learned how to take them without becoming the next meal. Imagine a group of early humans crouched in the tall grass, watching a lion pride tear apart a wildebeest. The air is thick with blood and dust. When the lions finally leave, full and heavy, the humans move in fast. Stones and sticks drive away the vultures. They slice off what meat remains, crack open bones for the rich marrow inside, and vanish before the hyenas arrive. That single act of timing and courage meant survival. Stealing from giants became a strategy. It required patience, planning, and teamwork. Each success taught them how to read the rhythms of other animals. The savannah became a living puzzle, and humans were learning how to solve it. Over time, the scavengers began to change the game. They realized they didn't have to wait for predators. They could become hunters themselves. But hunting large prey meant coordination, something no other animal did with such precision. A lone human was weak, but a group working together could become unstoppable. They learned to surround, distract, and strike at the right moment. Their weapons were simple stones, spears, and fire. But their true weapon was planning. The hunt became choreography, each movement guided by silent understanding and trust. Fear itself became a tool. Humans used fire to scare predators away from kills, smoke to flush animals out of hiding, and noise to drive herds into traps. What began as desperation evolved into strategy. They studied how prey reacted to sound, how wind carried scent, how moonlight changed visibility. Every hunt was an experiment, and every failure became data. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were learning how to control the rules of the food chain. The results were astonishing. As humans grew smarter and more coordinated, the balance of power shifted. Predators that once hunted them now avoided them. They didn't have claws or fangs, but they had memory and cooperation. Over generations, the savannah began to tell a new story. Humans were no longer running from danger. They were designing it. Each successful hunt reinforced what evolution was already rewarding, the ability to think ahead, to plan, to move as one. In a world of giants, intelligence became the equalizer. The early humans who once hid from shadows became the masters of movement, the planners of chaos. Fear had taught them how to listen, patience had taught them how to act, and together those lessons turned prey into predator. It was the first time in history that strategy, not strength, decided who lived to see the sunrise. Long before hospitals and science, humans learned to heal through accident and observation. They lived in a world where every scratch could kill, every infection could spread like fire. Survival wasn't just about hunting or hiding, it was about learning how not to die. The first healers weren't doctors. They were watchers, the people who noticed that some things hurt less when washed with smoke or soot, that certain roots numbed pain, that bitter plants could calm a fever. Their discoveries weren't written down. They were remembered in scars, stories, and the people who lived because of them. Picture a small camp at dusk. A child burns their hand on a fire. The pain is sharp, but someone presses cool ash against the wound, and the bleeding stops. Days later, the burn doesn't rot. That moment becomes memory, a spark of knowledge. Somewhere else, another human chews a strange leaf while sick and feels better by morning. These tiny experiments, repeated and shared, became the first medicine. Each discovery came with risk, but every survivor added one more page to humanity's growing book of life. The earliest medicines were hidden in plain sight. Ash mixed with water became antiseptic. Smoke kept insects away. Mud cooled swelling. Fire, once feared, became a tool for cleansing wounds. Humans began to notice patterns. The same plant that tasted terrible often had the strongest effect. The smell of a flower could calm the heart. The juice of a bark could stop bleeding. They learned by paying attention to the smallest changes, connecting cause and effect in a world that offered no second chances. Healing also required empathy. Someone had to care enough to tend to the sick, to share food with those too weak to move, to watch and wait for recovery. That compassion was a form of intelligence, a recognition that the survival of one meant the survival of all. If the injured lived, so did the knowledge of what helped them. Over generations, this instinct to help became part of who we are. Even when resources were scarce, humans made space for care. It wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. The healers became the memory keepers. They remembered which leaves worked, which mixtures failed, which smells warned of danger. They tested new ideas in desperate moments, guided by instinct and hope. Their cures were never perfect, but they were enough to keep small bands alive through disease and injury. Slowly, those fragments of wisdom began to form traditions. Certain plants became sacred, certain rituals respected. Healing became something close to magic, but it was really science in its earliest form. Every medicine today, every antibiotic, every vaccine, every surgery, traces back to that first fragile knowledge. A burned hand pressed into ash, a root chewed in pain, a fever cured by chance. The humans who survived did more than live through their wounds. They taught the species how to fight back against death. The first healers gave humanity its oldest miracle, the power to endure. Long before compasses and maps, humans looked up. The sky was their first calendar, their first navigation system, their first mystery. Each night, the stars returned in the same patterns, glowing like tiny fires pinned to the dark. At first, they were only decoration, something beautiful to break the fear of the night. But slowly, people began to notice that the stars moved in rhythm. Some rose earlier in the year, others vanished when the rains came. The sky was speaking, and humans learned to listen. Imagine a group of travelers walking across the plains under a moonlit sky. They have no tools, no written signs, just memory. One of them points to a cluster of stars near the horizon. They remember that when those lights appear, the herds start to move north. When they fade, the dry season begins. The group changes direction not by chance, but by the map above them. In a world without roads, the stars became the first guideposts. They told humans when to travel, when to plant, when to rest. Every flicker of light was a landmark in the vast unknown. The more humans watched, the more they understood. They noticed how the moon swelled and shrank, marking time like a clock. They learned that the sun's path shifted across the horizon with the seasons, rising in different spots each time of year. These patterns became memory, passed down through generations as stories and songs. The knowledge was too important to forget, so it was hidden inside myth. The hunter stars chased the prey stars across the sky. The river of light, what we now call the Milky Way, became a reflection of the rivers on Earth. Myth and science grew together. one explaining the world, the other helping people remember it. By learning the sky, humans learned to survive. Farmers watched for certain constellations that signaled the coming rains. Fishermen used the stars to find their way home when the ocean offered no landmarks. Nomads followed the wind and the moon's pull, their roots etched into memory long before any written record. The stars gave them consistency in a world that constantly changed. They were proof that some things never failed to return. But the stars did more than guide bodies. They guided minds. Looking up forced humans to think beyond themselves, to imagine distance, pattern, and time. The same curiosity that shaped the first tool now reached for the heavens. The night sky became a mirror of human thought, organized, mysterious, infinite. It inspired wonder and faith, fear and calculation. Even today, we still look up and search for meaning in those same constellations our ancestors named, with stories of gods and beasts. The sky was the first map, written in light instead of ink. It connected hunger to harvest, life to rhythm, and earth to the cosmos. Every journey we take, every clock we build, every spacecraft we launch, traces back to that moment when someone looked up and realized that the stars were not chaos, they were coordinates. And by following them, humans learned to find their place in the universe. The world began to freeze. Mountains of ice crawled across continents, swallowing valleys and forests. Oceans fell as water locked itself into glaciers. Winds grew colder, sharper, endless. For early humans, it was like living through the world's slowest disaster. Everything they knew about food, water, and warmth changed. The green plains turned white. Rivers froze solid. The great herds that once fed them vanished, chasing the last grasslands left on Earth. The Ice Age had arrived, and it demanded something new from humanity: adapt or die. Imagine standing at the edge of a glacier, the ground cracking beneath your feet, the air so cold it burns your lungs. This wasn't a single winter. It was an era that lasted tens of thousands of years. Whole generations were born and died in a world where the seasons no longer followed rules. For the first time, humans faced not just hunger or predators, but the planet itself. Yet even as ice claimed half the world, small bands of people refused to disappear. They learned how to live at the edge of the impossible. Clothing was their first defense. Skins scraped clean and softened over smoke became armor against the cold. They stitched hides together with bone needles and sinew threads, turning survival into craftsmanship. Fire became sacred again, not just for cooking but for living. They built shelters from stone, bone, and hide, low and tight to trap heat. Inside, flames flickered against walls carved with stories. The cold shaped not only their bodies, but their minds. Patience became a survival skill. Planning became second nature. As glaciers spread, so did human courage. Groups followed the migrating animals, trekking through frozen valleys and over icy plains. They discovered new paths, new lands, new resources. The Ice Age didn't just test humans, it expanded them. The same cold that threatened extinction also forced innovation. Hunters developed new tools, spears with sharper tips and throwing devices that allowed kills from a distance. Families learned to preserve meat by freezing it in the snow, turning the cold itself into a tool. Every hardship became a lesson, and every lesson was shared. Even the sky changed. The long nights stretched endlessly, and the stars became companions. Around fires, people told stories of the sun's return, of warmth that would one day come back. Hope became as vital as food. Without it, the cold would have won. In those dark winters, humans discovered endurance not as a choice, but as identity. They waited for spring, even when spring seemed like a myth. When the ice finally began to retreat, it left behind a new world and a new kind of human. Stronger, wiser, more patient. They had learned to weave courage into daily life, to find beauty even in struggle. The Ice Age had tried to erase them, but instead it carved them into something unbreakable. The edge of the ice was not the end. It was the forge that made humanity unshatterable. When humans first walked out of Africa, they thought they were alone, but the world they entered was already inhabited. Across the mountains and forests of Eurasia lived others who looked like them but were not quite the same. Some were broad and strong with deep-set eyes and heavy brows. Others were smaller, built for high mountains and thin air. They were our cousins, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, distant branches of the same ancient family tree. Meeting them was like seeing a reflection in rough glass, familiar yet foreign, and those encounters would change humanity forever. Imagine two groups crossing paths in the frozen hills of Ice Age Europe. The Neanderthals were already there, masters of cold survival. They hunted mammoths and built shelters from bone and hide. Their fires burned in caves long before modern humans arrived. When the newcomers stepped into their territory, the tension must have been electric. Were they enemies, strangers, or something more? We will never know the words they spoke, but the evidence in our DNA tells the truth. They met, they mixed, and they shared more than fire. The first meetings may have been cautious. Both species were skilled hunters, and both needed the same resources. But curiosity often wins over fear. Over time, contact led to exchange, perhaps tools or food, and eventually, families. Some unions were violent, others were gentle. The result was the same genes passed from one species to another. When scientists studied human DNA thousands of years later, they found fragments that didn't belong to us alone. 2% of the genome in many people today comes from Neanderthals. A few populations in Asia and the Pacific carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. We still carry the memory of those encounters in our blood. These exchanges weren't just genetic accidents, they were acts of survival. The Neanderthals had lived in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Their genes carried adaptations for cold, strong immune systems and the ability to thrive on meat-heavy diets. The Denisovans lived high in the mountains of Asia. Their DNA helped modern humans tolerate low oxygen levels, a gift that still allows people in Tibet and the Himalayas to live at extreme altitudes. These inheritances became part of us. Our cousins didn't vanish. They became us. For tens of thousands of years, the three species shared the world. They traded land, tools, and ideas. But slowly, one group began to spread farther and faster. Modern humans had something new: language, imagination, cooperation on a massive scale. The Neanderthals and Denisovans were not inferior, just outnumbered. Climate shifts and competition pushed them to the edges, and eventually their separate identities disappeared. But their legacy lived on in every heartbeat of the humans who followed. When we look in the mirror, we see the faces of survivors, but also the echoes of others who walked beside us. The story of humanity isn't one species triumphing over another. It's a merging, a reunion of long-lost relatives. We are the children of many worlds, descendants of wanderers, fighters, dreamers, and lovers who met in the cold and decided to share a future. There was a moment in our history when the world itself became the test. The continents that once seemed endless began to run out of space. Food grew scarce, climates shifted, and curiosity started whispering to the human heart. Beyond the mountains, beyond the sea, there had to be something more. The great crossings were not a single journey, but countless ones. Over tens of thousands of years, small bands of people left familiar lands behind and walked into the unknown. It was not conquest. It was survival mixed with wonder. Imagine standing on a shoreline, waves crashing at your feet, staring at the faint outline of land across the water. You don't know what lives there. You don't know if you'll make it. But behind you, the rivers have dried and the herds have gone. The only path left is forward. Someone gathers logs, vines, and courage, lashing together a crude raft. When the tide turns, they push off. That single act of bravery becomes the start of a new chapter in human history. For early humans, coastlines were highways. The sea provided fish, shells, and salt, and its edge offered a path that rarely disappeared. Step by step, generation after generation, they followed the water. From Africa to Arabia, from Asia to Australia, they moved not as conquerors, but as explorers. When the world's oceans were lower, land bridges connected continents. Humans walked across them without realizing they were walking into new worlds. Siberia into Alaska, Indonesia into Australia, the Pacific Islands dotted like stepping stones across vast blue emptiness. Everywhere humans went, they carried fire, memory, and stories of home. The reasons for leaving were as diverse as the people themselves. Some fled droughts, some followed animals, some were simply curious. That curiosity, more than strength or tools, was humanity's compass. Every risk-taker, every wanderer, carried within them a small piece of the instinct that drives discovery. They faced storms, hunger, predators, and isolation, yet they kept going. Every successful crossing meant new lands to learn, new resources to use, and new challenges to overcome. The great crossings changed everything. They spread humans to every continent except Antarctica. Each journey scattered our species wider and thinner, yet somehow more connected than ever. Stories traveled as fast as footsteps. Songs of faraway mountains and oceans became myths that tied distant groups together. When one group reached the edge of the world, they built boats to go further. When the land ended, imagination began. Looking back, it's hard to believe what they achieved with so little. No maps, no engines, no guarantees, just willpower, instinct, and the courage to follow horizons. The Great Crossings were more than migration. They were humanity's declaration that no boundary was final. Every voyage carried the same ancient promise, that somewhere beyond the unknown there would be life. And because they believed that, because they dared to step onto the water and keep going, the human story became a global one. Long before kings and governments, before cities or written laws, there was something older and far more fragile keeping humanity together. It began around the fire. Small groups huddled close at night, their faces lit by flickering light, sharing food and stories. They had no prisons, no police, no armies. What they had instead were agreements, invisible but powerful, woven out of trust. Fireside law was born not from authority, but from understanding that survival depended on peace within the group. If you broke that peace, you risked everything. Imagine 30 people sharing a single camp, each one depending on the others for food, warmth, and safety. One person hunts, another gathers, someone watches for danger. Everyone has a role. If one person steals, if one person hoards food or starts a fight, the balance collapses. In the wild, there's no one to appeal to, no higher power to fix what's broken. The group must fix itself. So humans began to invent rules. Don't take more than you need. Share what you find. Protect the weak. Respect the hunt. Simple ideas, but they kept chaos away. These rules weren't written in stone. They lived in memory and habit, passed down through example. Children watched how adults acted, and through imitation learned what was acceptable. Every group had its own rhythm. Some marked important moments with rituals. Others used stories to warn about greed, betrayal, or dishonor. If someone broke the code, punishment came not from violence, but from shame or exile. Being cast out meant certain death, so obedience wasn't forced, it was chosen. Cooperation became instinct. Gift exchange was one of the oldest forms of law. Sharing wasn't charity, it was insurance. When you gave something to another person, you created a bond, a future promise. Someday, when you needed help, they would return it. These small exchanges built webs of trust that stretched between families and even between different groups. Over time, these connections became the foundation of trade, alliances, and eventually societies. The first economy wasn't about money, It was about memory. Taboos also emerged, guiding behavior in ways that protected the group. Certain foods were avoided, not because of superstition, but because people noticed patterns between sickness and what they ate. Certain relationships were forbidden because they caused conflict or weakened the gene pool. What began as practical wisdom turned into belief. Religion, in its earliest form, may have started as a way to explain why these invisible rules mattered. Obedience became sacred because it kept people alive. The fireside laws didn't stop people from arguing, but they gave them a reason to stay together. The warmth of the fire reminded everyone that unity was survival. When humans began to live in larger groups, those same invisible agreements evolved into codes, traditions, and justice systems. But at their core, they all came from the same place. The fire, the stories, the need to belong. Before there were rulers, there was respect. Before there was punishment, there was understanding. And before civilization, there was the quiet law of the firelight, teaching us how to live together. At some point in our long story, humans began to look at death differently. Before that, when someone died, their body was just another part of nature. The bones were left for scavengers, the flesh returned to the soil. But something changed deep inside the human mind. For the first time, people didn't just see a body, they saw a person. Someone who mattered, someone who had shared food, laughter, danger, and dreams. The moment humans started to care about the dead was the moment they began to see meaning in life itself. Imagine a small group gathering at the edge of a cave. A child has died. The air is heavy with silence. Instead of walking away, they stay. Someone places flowers near the body. Another sprinkles red powder, made from crushed ochre, turning the ground a deep, vivid color. The pigment isn't practical. It doesn't protect or preserve. It's symbolic, a message written in color that says this life mattered. The burial becomes an act of love, of memory, of something larger than survival. That is how humanity learned to speak without words. Archaeologists have found these early graves across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Bodies buried with beads, tools, and sometimes entire animal skulls. These objects weren't left by accident. They were offerings, tokens of identity and belonging. Some graves show signs of ritual, with bones arranged carefully, faces painted, and fires burned nearby. To bury the dead was to make a promise, not just to the person lost, but to those still living, that their existence had meaning, that they would not be forgotten. This was more than grief. It was imagination. To bury someone means to believe in something beyond the visible. Maybe it was an afterlife, maybe just remembrance. Either way, humans had started to create invisible worlds in their minds. The same creativity that shaped tools and language was now shaping belief. For the first time, humans were not just reacting to the world, they were interpreting it. As art emerged, the connection between life and meaning deepened. People began to decorate themselves with beads made from shells and bones. They carved patterns into stone, painted animals on cave walls, and used pigments to transform their appearance. These acts weren't necessary for survival, but they fed another kind of hunger, the hunger to express, to connect, to remember. Beauty became a language, and through it, humans began to understand themselves. Even today, when we place flowers on a grave or build monuments to those we've lost, we are repeating that same ancient ritual. The first humans who buried their dead were not just mourners. They were storytellers. They looked at bones and saw more than remains. They saw proof that love, memory, and purpose could outlast death. The bones that speak tell us that long before we built civilizations or wrote history, we had already learned the greatest lesson of all, that meaning matters as much as meat, and remembering each other is what makes us human. The earth has never been gentle with us. It shakes, burns, floods, and freezes without warning. Volcanoes darken the sky, superstorms drown the land, and plagues turn whole villages silent. Every generation of humans has faced disaster, and every time, those who survived learned something new about endurance. The planet itself became our greatest teacher. Each catastrophe left behind lessons carved into memory. Those who ignored them vanished. Those who learned carried humanity forward. Imagine a night when the sky turns red, the air fills with ash, and the ground trembles under your feet. A volcano has erupted, louder than thunder, brighter than lightning. The world is chaos. Animals flee in every direction, rivers boil, crops vanish beneath grey snow. For weeks the sun hides, and the air smells of sulphur. In that darkness, humans learned the meaning of preparation. They began to store food, to build shelters in safer places, to think beyond today. A disaster became a teacher that whispered one rule: never be caught off guard again. Floods and storms taught the same lesson in their own way. Rivers that once gave life could also destroy it. One season, too much rain, and everything was gone. People began to watch the skies, to read the wind, to mark the changing of clouds. They learned that patterns could predict danger. They built on higher ground, created paths for escape, and left behind signals for others. Out of destruction came the first science of observation. The more the world hurt them, the better they became at understanding it. Plagues were the cruelest teacher of all. A single illness could wipe out whole groups, leaving fires burning in empty camps. Humans didn't know what germs were, but they noticed connections. The sick touched water, and others fell ill. Food left uncovered led to death. From these terrible patterns, new customs emerged: cooking food thoroughly, burning the belongings of the dead, avoiding strangers during sickness. It wasn't medicine yet, but it was knowledge. Fear had become logic, and logic saved lives. As the centuries passed, humans began to think differently about disaster. Instead of running from it, they started preparing for it. They created caches of food and tools, small stashes hidden in caves or buried underground. They learned to travel far from danger, to split groups so that no single catastrophe could end them all. This way of thinking became part of our evolution. When everything collapsed, someone always survived somewhere. Disaster made humans cautious but also creative. Each crisis forced innovation. Fire led to new building methods. Floods inspired irrigation. Droughts created trade between groups who once ignored each other. Pain became progress. Even now, when the world shakes or storms rise, we follow the same old instinct to prepare, to adapt, to endure. The earth never promised to be safe. It promised to be unpredictable. And in that chaos, humans found their strength. We are the students of disaster, forged by fire, wind, and plague into a species that refuses to give up. If humanity had one secret weapon, it wasn't strength or speed, it was the stomach. While other animals specialized in one kind of food, humans learned to eat almost anything that didn't kill them. When the great hunters went extinct, we cracked open their bones. When the forests withered, we dug up roots. When the sea seemed endless, we found shellfish hidden beneath the tide. Being a generalist meant we were never trapped by any single fate. Whatever the world threw at us, we found a way to turn it into nourishment. Imagine a beach 200,000 years ago. The tide has gone out, leaving behind a slick field of seaweed and rock pools. A small group of humans kneels at the shore, prying open clams with sharpened stones. The air smells of salt and smoke from a fire where the shells hiss and pop. Far inland, drought has killed the grasslands, but here, the ocean still gives. The people who learned to eat from the sea survived, while others starved. Shellfish became the first reliable fast food of prehistory, rich in protein and impossible to overhunt. Far from the coast, others learned different lessons. They cracked bones to reach the soft marrow inside, scavenging what lions left behind. They discovered that boiling made roots edible, that smoke could preserve meat, that insects carried more nutrition than they looked like they should. Each of these discoveries widened the menu of survival. No single landscape could defeat a creature that could make a meal out of almost anything. This flexibility wasn't just practical, it shaped our evolution. Our jaws became smaller, our teeth more balanced, our brains bigger because cooked, varied food provided the fuel for thought. Being generalists also changed how humans moved. We followed the seasons, not the species. When herds vanished, we turned to plants. When plants failed, we hunted small game or fished. This constant adjustment made us the ultimate adapters. Other predators starved when their prey disappeared. Humans packed up and kept walking. Every environment became a challenge to decode, a puzzle to solve. The people who could read the land like a story, who knew where to dig, when to gather, what to avoid, became the keepers of knowledge. They turned geography into cuisine. Over time, our flexible appetite became culture. Food was no longer just survival. It became memory, identity, and comfort. The plants you gathered, the animals you hunted, the way you cooked them, all told others who you were and where you came from. Around every fire, the same story played out again and again. Someone trying something new and teaching the rest what worked. Curiosity and hunger were inseparable. Even now, that ancient flexibility lives in us. We eat from every corner of the planet. We combine flavors, invent dishes, and share recipes the same way our ancestors shared survival tips. The generalist's gift still guides us. It's why humans, more than any other species, can thrive in deserts, jungles, cities, or ice. The secret of our success has always been simple. We never waited for the world to feed us. We learned to feed ourselves from the world. Before there were books or languages, there were stories. They were told in gestures, in rhythm, in the crackle of the firelight reflected in a dozen wide eyes. A story could teach faster than pain, warn better than scars, and unite people in a way instinct never could. Instinct only reacts to the present, but stories let humans visit the past and imagine the future. They turned experience into rehearsal. Every tale was a survival manual disguised as entertainment. Picture a night 200,000 years ago. The hunt has ended, the fire glows low, and the group gathers close. An elder begins to speak, their voice slow and rhythmic. They describe the lion that stalked them at dusk, how it moved, how it waited, how they escaped. Children lean in, memorizing every detail. By the end of the story, they've learned how to survive a predator they've never faced. That is the power of narrative. It carries danger safely inside memory. You don't have to nearly die to learn the lesson. You just have to listen. Stories also built courage. Hunters shared tales of battles won against mammoths or storms. These weren't just boasts, they were maps of emotion. The story let everyone feel fear, then victory, without facing the real risk. The next time they stood before danger, their minds already knew the pattern. That mental rehearsal, what we now call imagination, became the difference between panic and precision. Humans could plan for what hadn't happened yet, turning fiction into evolution's secret weapon. Cautionary tales were just as important. Somewhere along the line, people realized that fear could be used to protect. A story about a spirit haunting a dark cave kept children from wandering into danger. A myth about angering the river god reminded everyone not to drink from polluted water. These weren't lies, they were codes. Each warning hid real wisdom inside magic and mystery. The story engine didn't care about truth in the modern sense. It cared about survival. The more humans told stories, the more complex their minds became. Language grew to fit the need. Words like before, after, maybe, and someday were invented to talk about things that didn't exist yet. That shift changed everything. Once you can imagine tomorrow, you can prepare for it. Stories gave us time travel long before science did. They taught us empathy too, letting us live inside other minds and feel their struggles. Through that shared imagination, groups became stronger, more cooperative, and more human. Every tale told around a campfire, every myth painted on a cave wall, was an act of programming the human brain for survival. We became creatures powered by imagination, guided by fiction as much as fact. Even now, when we watch movies or listen to podcasts, we're feeding that same ancient engine. Stories are how we remember, how we learn, and how we dream our way past extinction. Long before we wrote history, we told it. And in those stories, we rehearsed every future we were brave enough to imagine. As the world warmed after the Ice Age, the human population began to surge. What had once been scattered families became networks of hundreds, then thousands. Villages formed near rivers, coastlines, and fertile plains. At first, this new closeness felt like strength. More people meant more hands for building, more eyes for watching danger, more voices for song and story. But too many people in one place also meant competition. Food, space, and water became arguments waiting to happen. Humanity had entered the pressure cooker. The challenge was no longer survival against nature, it was survival among ourselves. Imagine two neighbouring groups sharing the same valley. For years, they hunt and gather without issue. Then a dry season comes. The herds move elsewhere, and the plants don't return. Suddenly, the valley that once fed everyone can only feed one group. The first fights in human history weren't about greed. They were about survival under pressure. Spears that once hunted game now turned toward each other. But something unexpected happened. Some groups found ways to stop fighting. They learned to trade. Trade was the first form of diplomacy. Instead of taking what they needed by force, humans began to exchange what they had. Shells from the sea were traded for stone from the mountains. Dried meat for obsidian blades. Over time, these exchanges became predictable. Paths were worn into the land where people met to barter, talk, and share news. With trade came trust, and with trust came alliances. Groups that once fought began to depend on each other. The same rivers that divided them now connected them. Crowding also changed how humans thought about identity. When small bands lived alone, they saw the world in simple terms, us and everything else. But in larger gatherings, there was suddenly another kind of them, strangers who spoke differently, dressed differently, worshipped differently. This difference could lead to conflict, but it could also lead to curiosity. People began to mimic, borrow, and blend ideas. A new invention in one valley could spread hundreds of miles through trade routes and storytelling. Diversity became a strength disguised as chaos. Living in crowds also forced humans to invent rules on a new scale. Fireside law wasn't enough anymore. You couldn't rely on personal trust when dealing with people you might never meet again. So symbols appeared: carved marks, tokens, and shared rituals that represented honesty or belonging. These were the first steps toward contracts, treaties, and economies. The human mind was learning to manage distance, not just in space, but in relationships. By creating trade and diplomacy, humans discovered a way to release the pressure before it exploded. The same instincts that once caused conflict now fueled cooperation. Population growth didn't destroy us. It transformed us. Every deal made around a campfire, every gift carried across miles, every piece kept through exchange was a rehearsal for civilization. The world was growing crowded, but instead of breaking apart, humans began to connect. Out of the pressure came something entirely new, a global mind learning to share its own survival. Some inventions change everything, not because they are big, but because they multiply what humans can do. A sharpened stick becomes a spear, and suddenly animals too fast or too strong to hunt become dinner. A thread pulled through, hide becomes clothing, and people survive in lands once too cold to bear. A woven net turns a single person into a harvester of rivers. These tools didn't just make life easier. They unlocked entire new worlds. Each one started a cascade, a chain reaction that allowed humans to live in places no one thought possible. Imagine a hunter on a windy plain 40,000 years ago. His prey is faster than he is, stronger too. The spear in his hand is deadly, but only up close. Then someone discovers leverage. A curved stick with a hook at one end, what we now call a spear thrower, can launch a dart farther and harder than human muscle alone. With it, one hunter becomes many, distance becomes safety, accuracy becomes survival. That small leap in design means more food, fewer deaths, and the freedom to move into harsher lands. A single tool changes the balance between predator and prey. Far from the hunt, another quiet revolution unfolds. A piece of bone shaped into a slender point and drilled with a hole becomes the needle. For the first time, hides can be stitched tightly instead of tied. Clothes fit better, hold heat longer, and keep out rain. People begin to explore colder regions, following herds into ice and snow. The needle turns weather from enemy to challenge. It is simple, almost invisible, yet it opens half the planet to human life. Then comes the net, a lattice of plant fibers or sinew that traps fish, birds, and small animals. It doesn't just work harder than one person. It works while they rest. The net multiplies time. One human can feed many, and that surplus changes everything. More food means more people mean more ideas. Innovation begins to feed on itself. Each tool makes room for others. The cascade never stops. The beauty of these inventions is that none of them required genius. They came from observation, from trial and error, from the slow work of hands and minds repeating small experiments over generations. Yet their effects were enormous. Tools extended the limits of the human body. They turned weakness into advantage. They freed people from the immediate grip of hunger and gave them the space to think, plan, and dream. Every major leap in human history starts this way. One small improvement that ripples outward through everything else. From stone flakes to fire, from nets to sails, from needles to circuits, the pattern never changes. Each new tool reshapes not just the environment, but the humans who wield it. The story of invention is the story of amplification, of turning imagination into survival, and survival into mastery. The cascade never ends because we never stop creating it. 12,000 years ago, a few humans made the biggest bet in history. They stopped moving. Instead of chasing food, they tried to grow it. It began quietly in river valleys and grasslands, where someone noticed that dropped seeds grew again after the rains. It was an idea so simple it seemed harmless. Why wander when you could plant your next meal? But the shift from hunter to farmer was not a straight climb upward. It was a gamble that changed everything about how humans lived, ate, and even died. Imagine a small band of foragers watching wild grains sway in the wind. They gather the seeds and store them in baskets. The next season, instead of moving on, they stay and scatter a few near their camp. When green shoots appear, it must feel like magic food coming from the ground. Soon, they build shelters nearby, and one generation later, the first village is born. Life slows down. The old rhythm of following herds and weather gives way to waiting for harvests. The world begins to shrink to the size of a field. Farming brought abundance, but it also brought fragility. When the crops grew, there was more food than ever before. People could feed children through winters, trade grain for tools, and plan ahead in ways their ancestors never could. But when crops failed, starvation came harder. A drought could wipe out an entire community. Hunters could always move on, but farmers were trapped by their soil. The same plants that fed them also tied them to the land. It was resilience and vulnerability in the same breath. Surplus changed society. Once people could store food, not everyone had to gather it. Some became builders, potters, priests, or guards. Villages grew into towns. Towns became cities. The extra food powered population booms and inventions. It also created inequality. Those who controlled storage controlled power, walls rose, hierarchies formed, and for the first time, humans began living under rules written by others. The world of equals around the campfire slowly faded into history. Farming also rewrote the human body. Diets narrowed from hundreds of wild plants and animals to a few staples like wheat, rice, and corn. People grew shorter and weaker bones. Diseases once rare among foragers began spreading in crowded settlements. Living close to animals introduced new infections. Measles, flu, and smallpox all began as animal diseases that jumped to humans. The same abundance that kept communities fed also made them sick. Yet, despite all this, farming stuck. It offered something no other way of life could: predictability. The ground, once a mystery, became a partner. Every seed planted was a promise to the future. Over time, humans learned to manage floods, build irrigation, and breed crops that bent to their will. The farmer's gamble paid off, but not without cost. It made civilization possible while binding us to labor, hierarchy, and disease. Humanity traded freedom for stability and movement for control. From that moment on, the world would never wander the same way again. The first cities didn't rise in a single moment of genius. They grew slowly, brick by brick, from the quiet hum of villages that refused to stay small. People gathered where rivers met, where soil was rich, and trade paths crossed. Over time, huts became neighborhoods, paths became streets, and marketplaces became capitals. Humanity had spent millions of years surviving through kinship and trust. But now, a new question appeared. How do you keep strangers working together without tearing each other apart? The answer would reshape the world forever. Imagine walking through one of those early cities 6,000 years ago. The air smells of clay and smoke. Farmers carry baskets of grain through narrow streets. Merchants shout prices. Children chase goats between mud brick walls. Somewhere, a scribe sits near a temple, carving marks into wet tablets. Those marks are numbers, counts of food, debts, and trade goods. This is the birth of writing. Not for poetry, not for story, but for survival. Words became tools to remember who owed what, who owned what, and how much was stored in the granary. Memory had outgrown the mind. As cities expanded, they needed more than memory. They needed management. Someone had to collect grain for the hungry, repair irrigation, guard the walls, and settle disputes. Bureaucracy, though dull in name, was one of humanity's greatest inventions. It turned chaos into order through lists and ledgers, through rules written in clay and ink. For the first time, societies were run by systems instead of instincts. The city itself became a living organism, breathing through its people, pulsing through trade, exhaling ideas that would spread across continents. But the cost of coordination was complexity. In small bands, everyone knew everyone. In a city, most people were strangers. Trust could no longer rely on familiarity, so humans invented new kinds of glue laws, religions, and shared identities. Temples and palaces rose side by side, symbols of both faith and power. Rulers claimed divine authority, scribes recorded their words, and citizens obeyed not because they knew their leaders, but because the system worked. Survival now depended not on a single person's skill, but on everyone following the same invisible script. Cities transformed the human story from one of adaptation to one of design. People began reshaping landscapes to fit their needs, digging canals, building roads, and carving monuments. Each generation added layers of complexity: markets, armies, schools, and archives. But beneath all the grandeur was the same ancient problem: how to make cooperation last. Writing solved it by giving knowledge a body that outlived memory. Rules written down could survive floods, famines, even the death of kings. They became civilization's lungs, allowing it to breathe across centuries. The The first cities were fragile, yet they represented something completely new, a network of strangers who trusted paper more than instinct, symbols more than faces. That trust built the modern world. From the bricks of Uruk to the skyscrapers of New York, every city is still an experiment in managing human connection. The walls have changed, but the question remains the same. How do you make millions of strangers act like one heartbeat? 8 billion humans now cover the planet. From orbit, our cities glow like constellations. We build machines that think, rockets that leave Earth, and networks that stretch across oceans. It looks like we have conquered everything, yet beneath that success lies a truth older than language. We are still the same fragile species that almost went extinct 900,000 years ago. The bottleneck that once reduced our ancestors to barely more than 1,000 individuals left a mark that never faded. Our diversity, biological and behavioral, is thinner than it should be for a creature this widespread. We are a giant built on delicate bones. Genetically, humans are strange. Chimpanzees living in separate valleys of Africa show more variation than all of us combined. That ancient near-death event left us remarkably uniform. It's why blood transfusions and organ donations can cross continents, but it's also why pandemics spread like wildfire. What kills one of us can kill millions. When a new disease appears, it moves faster than our defenses. The same connected world that shares music and science also shares infection. The past few decades have proven how fast one cough can circle the globe. The Earth isn't small, it's just too well connected. But our greatest weakness has always doubled as our strength: cooperation. The same instinct that kept small groups alive through famine and ice now binds billions through science, communication, and empathy. When disaster strikes, our survival still depends on how well we work together. Every vaccine, every global relief effort, every scientific breakthrough is just a modern version of the ancient circle around the fire. The tools have changed, but the principle hasn't. Those who share survive. Those who isolate vanish. The irony of modern abundance is that it hides how thin our margin truly is. We can feed billions, yet one failed harvest or disrupted trade route can spark famine. We can build skyscrapers that scrape the clouds, yet they depend on invisible systems, grids, data, supply chains that can collapse overnight. Our ancestors feared lions and droughts. We fear blackouts, cyber attacks, and viruses too small to see. The dangers evolved, but the pattern stayed the same. Nature never stopped testing us, it just changed the exam. Still, cooperation remains the answer. It's not just about kindness, it's about survival written into our DNA. We're here because our ancestors shared food when there wasn't enough, because they warned each other of storms, because they taught what they knew instead of hoarding it. Every generation since has faced its own version of the same challenge: stay together or fall apart. Modern technology magnifies that choice. We can connect instantly, but connection means nothing without understanding. The fragile giant we've built stands tall only because billions of minds keep it balanced. One storm, one virus, one war can shake it, but what holds it up is the same thing that once held a small band of survivors together under the stars: trust, cooperation, and the will to keep going no matter how dark the horizon gets. Look around. Every city, every hand that builds, every mind that dreams, each one is a continuation of a story that almost ended countless times. Humanity is not a miracle of perfection. It is a miracle of persistence. We have been tested by ice and fire, by hunger and disease, by our own fears and ambitions. Yet the thread has never snapped. 2 million years of trial and error, of almost disappearing, have woven us into what we are now. Every breath we take is proof that survival itself can be an art form. Imagine that thread stretched from the first toolmaker on the African plains to the digital hum of the modern world. It runs through volcanic ash and ancient oceans, through caves lit by firelight and cities glowing from orbit. Every invention, every discovery, every act of compassion or defiance is a knot in that thread. When our ancestors nearly vanished 900,000 years ago, the line could have ended, but one small group held on. When droughts turned forests to dust, when glaciers swallowed half the world, they adapted, taught, and rebuilt. The thread tightened but never broke. Each of us carries the evidence of that endurance inside our cells. The fused chromosome that marks the survivors of the ancient bottleneck, the immune defenses borrowed from Neanderthals and Denisovans, the genetic echoes of countless migrations and encounters. Every human alive is a living archive of every hardship that didn't win. We walk around carrying the signatures of volcanoes, famines, and plagues that shaped us long before memory. The unbroken thread isn't just history, it's biology, but it's also culture. The stories told around fires became the laws of cities. The instincts that kept small bands alive became empathy, science, and cooperation. Every time one generation passed knowledge to the next, the thread gained another strand. It's in our music, in our languages, in the way we reach for each other when everything falls apart. Even now, surrounded by skyscrapers and satellites, we're still the same species that once huddled together under cold stars, whispering stories of how they made it through another night. The thread is fragile but resilient. It stretches across every continent, connecting hunters to astronauts, cave painters to filmmakers, parents to children. It reminds us that the distance between then and now isn't as wide as it feels. The same hands that carved stone tools now shape code. The same curiosity that followed herds across deserts now sends rovers across planets. Everything we are began with the decision to keep going. 2 million years of almost failing, and that's our inheritance. The unbroken thread runs through every one of us, binding past to present and reminding us that survival is not just endurance, it's imagination, cooperation, and hope. When you breathe, when you think, when you create, you are adding one more twist to the thread that began long before your name existed. And as long as we keep passing it forward, the story of humanity will never truly end.